same thing. I certainly would grant that capitalism does one of those, but I would suggest that the strength of capitalism is that it doesn't do the other. It lets people voluntarily enter into contractual arrangements, negotiations, and determine for themselves what value they're willing to accept or not. So I don't want to get too picky in terminology, but I would suggest that distinction is a fair one to point out. One notion of Marxism might say that, well, that wouldn't happen in this iteration of Marxism, or it would, and I'm not here to paint with too broad a brush for the other side. But I do think that's a distinction we're drawing. And I also think that Marx isn't the guy you want to look at if you do want to put a value on the human heart. I think you would see that as not hard-headed enough of an attitude to take towards promoting social change, honestly.
One very quick clarification I can make, if possible. I'm not against voluntary unionization of workers. I am opposed to government being in league with you. It's just a quick clarification. Anything that's voluntary, I like.
Okay, I will grant one more round of rebuttal for this, and then we can move on. So, someone had a rebuttal over here.
Talk about the decline in factory accidents as you get less state intervention in the capitalist system.
I didn't say less. I just said there was a decline before OSHA was created in, I think, the 70s. So.
Well, I'd have to disagree with that. Just from that standpoint, OSHA does a hell of a job keeping people safe at work, checking, because, I mean, the capitalists, frankly, if you see through history, the times when we had our most laissez-faire system with the rise of Rockefeller, etc., it was very unsafe for workers. You had children working in mines from sun up to sun down. You talked about, 1/3 union membership, and they didn't get rising wages. They acquired the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, all these safety regulations, all these rules to constrain capitalism. That's where the contradictions of capitalism come in. That when you let these capitalists constantly exploit these people in any way they want, the system itself knows that, hey, this is getting out of control, and the government constantly has to intervene. You can't have, I'm sorry, I don't believe in anarcho-capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without a state. Talked about voluntary relations. When your choice, I go back to the typical argument, but it's true. When the choice is starvation or $7.25 an hour, which one are you going to pick? I mean, that's not voluntary. That's coercion. You're threatening people with death unless they work under your wing. And just kind of a little bit of an anecdote. Placing value on the human heart. There was an article that came out recently. It was one economist affiliated with the University of Chicago, and the other one was whatever Stanford's economics thing is. Yeah, that's it. They actually determined that a free market would be viable for kidneys. There's a kidney shortage in the United States, and they placed an estimated value on the human kidney of $15,000. Now, with that, I've used the argument that where does that go with human trafficking? I mean, you got people being you get human trafficking with sex. You have slavery still exists, not in the United States, except wage slavery. But I mean, you do have in other countries that, how far do you let people go? I mean, what if I wanted someone's kidney to sell it because I'm starving because the capitalists won't pay me enough, so I go kill someone and sell their organ for $15,000.
Okay, I mean, basically what you're saying is we shouldn't have bad people in the world. I mean, capitalism isn't the reason there's people cutting out organs. I mean, there were awful people before capitalism ever existed.
And you're giving them, you're putting the property in their hands.
It's not their property if they're doing it by force. I mean, we're not in favor of kidnapping people and stealing their kidneys. Is anyone?
Capitalism does produce a mode of being. Economic system, a la Marx, produces modes of being, ways of being in the world, right? And in a capitalist society, you're encouraged, if not rewarded, for having a particular instrumental mentality towards things, cost-benefit analysis is the mode of operating, and you can turn anything into something that can be bought and sold, right? This is the mode of being, right? Also, the mode of being is such that greedy self-interest, right, is elevated to the ultimate value, right? And so you know, you can talk about it being a human nature thing, but this is, Marx says that this is a mode of thinking that, you know, that feeds the system, right? When you think that certain human attributes of selfishness, which is foundation of capitalist theory and everything else, you know, is part of nature, then you don't question it, right? And all of these things together, I don't think, you know, fosters a humane way of mode of being. You talked about how communist societies have been so murderous and harmful. I mean, I don't think, should I talk about all the harms and destructive aspects of American society? How many people have we killed as Americans in the last 10 years, right? You know, if you look at the number of people in the world that Americans are responsible for, you and I, whether it's through the drones, whether it's invasion of Iraq, the idiotic invasion of Iraq, to all these different invasions, right? We've killed hundreds of thousands of people. But we're not even thinking about this, right? Not to mention the number of people in prison. There are almost 2 million people in prison, and for another 4 million on probation or parole, right? Not to mention the number of people in poverty. Not to mention the fact that we're running out of bees, butterflies, and fish, right? With the destructive environment. Capitalism is an inherently, incredibly productive, destructive enterprise, right? And if this is the only thing we got, then we're screwed, right?
Okay, I mean, I would say the difference between the horrible regimes of, you know, Stalinist Russia and Maoist China and our current United States, aside from the sheer number of people we kill and the way in which we do it, George Bush didn't open up a Milton Friedman book or an Adam Smith book and say, wow, I should invade Iraq and kill all these people. However, the Bolsheviks did open up the Communist Manifesto and say, you know, we need to start a revolution, which resulted in deaths of millions of people. That was directly related to Karl Marx's writing. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were not directly related to any capitalist thinker. Some will argue that they were for oil profits and whatnot, but again, we're not in favor of, you know, going and stealing people's stuff. We're in favor of a capitalist system with a minimal state in which actions are voluntary. You have free trade, you have free exchange. I don't necessarily see what's wrong with that. I don't think there's much of an alternative. In reference to, like, you know, the doomsday scenario that was just given to us, I don't think that's correct at all. What we've seen is, since 1990, 50% of the people in absolute poverty in the world are no longer in absolute poverty. You don't hear that a lot. It was a Millennium Development Goal by the UN. 50% of the people that once were in absolute poverty no longer are. It's the most peaceful decade we've had for hundreds of years, believe it or not. Malaria rates are going down, more people are owning homes. It's easier for poor people to live in wealth that 200 years ago wasn't imaginable. The world is actually getting a bit better overall, believe it or not. Yeah, good for us.
Everyone off right there, because that was actually a build-up of an audience question. I want to get back to the test. Yeah, great build-up, but
Thank you, Jeff.
given that we've talked about it and, you know, mentioned it, how big of a role should government play? I feel like that's a general question for both. I'll start with Team Capitalism this time.
I don't have a specific answer. I mean, in what?
And just because you've both been arguing, you know, that either the state shouldn't be involved, they're saying that it's a necessity that the state needs to be involved for the continuation of capitalism. It seems like there's a little bit of, you don't need the state for, you know, the successes of capitalism,
Sure.
or you need minimalists. So
Yeah.
what is the exact?
Well, I agree with my colleague that just because the state does something and it's a state that has capitalism as a dominant, you know, economic system, that doesn't mean capitalism is to blame for what the state does. I would gladly concede that by all the evidence that we have, that the state's not going anywhere anytime soon, and any capitalist recognizes externalities exist, public goods exist, and that may need to be tweaked or adjusted, and you're going to do that on the fly. I mean, we are a public university. If you don't like that, capitalism's provided you with alternatives, some of them very near here. We're making do with less money. I think we both like to get more state funding, but you know, we have less than we did a few years ago, so we're, you know, less of a public university than we used to be, and I, you know, my self-interest is I don't like that, because I'm that weird kind of capitalist who gets paid by the state, but we're adjusting, and, you know, in a capitalistic system, that's easier to do. I don't have to fill out forms in triplicate to get my syllabus okay. I have plenty of autonomy to teach, you know, as I see fit, even in as a ward of the state, so to speak. And so, you know, the role of government depends on what we're talking about. I think what capitalism does a very good job of is, you know, and I'm sure I'm setting up a disagreement here, but it knows its place fairly well in some respects. You know, I honestly think, and maybe we're reading, you know, different Marx, but you know, the Marx that I read is a Marx who appreciated capitalism's ability to tame nature and speed forward economic development. And it's a Marx who probably wouldn't be, you know, quite as, you know, just whatever. Great, you've got a Pope who's calling for addressing unemployment and I mean, capitalism isn't unnerved by that. You know, you have certain very rich people who don't quite, you know, understand capitalism, but who profited from it, who might object to how it makes them feel. But you know, America isn't up in arms. It's just a counterpoint, and it's got its enclave or its place to express itself. And if at the end of the workday you want to go home and write a check to a church-funded charity, I don't think any capitalist is going to try to prevent you. So capitalism is very good at letting other forms, other institutions have their say too.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say, you know, it's not a foregone conclusion that without government protecting private property, it wouldn't exist. So to my friends in the audience, the anarcho-capitalists, I think it's very possible you could have capitalism without a state someday. Never say never. But I also think there's nothing wrong with certain state interventions. You know, for example, protecting against pollution. Pollution is something that can negatively affect a large number of people that have nothing to do with, you know, the factory in question per se. But you know, even if you support more government intervention, like I said in the beginning, even if you support those socialist states in Europe, they're still heavily capitalist. They're still very capitalist. The way they got their wealth is through that industrialization, that entrepreneurship. So, I mean, Marx wasn't about just giving out more food stamps in a capitalist system. He was about the total upheaval of it, the moving past of a capitalist system. So unless you agree with that, you're not necessarily a Marxist.
And your answer to the question?
I don't understand how that doesn't make you a Marxist. I mean, all those things are because of capitalism's inherent contradictions, all of those readjustments to the capitalist system itself. It doesn't make the capitalist system superior when you still have so many people being exploited by so few people. When there's people there's people in the United States, for example, that own 6 houses, and there's people who can't afford a house. There are more empty houses in the United States today than there are people in the streets. So in other words, we could just fill every house with every homeless person. It's just because somebody owns the private property rights to that house that they are not allowed to live there. And it's these owners of private property, frankly, like he said, they're taught not to care about other people. So I mean, if you want real change, it's outside of the system. You have to rethink the system itself, not readjust the system.
Or readjust it so that I can get an answer for you guys. I understand it was a rebuttal, but what role does government play, since they kind of gave their sort of interpretation?
You're asking me, or?
Just the team as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, basically it has to do what it's doing, at least. I think it could do more. In France, there's a reason why Francois Hollande puts a 75% tax on people who make $1.3 million or over. It's because they're hoarding everything while others are suffering. Morally, it's just incorrect. If you want to talk about Roosevelt and the New Deal, he was pressured by those socialist groups and those unions that you say didn't really do anything. They were the ones who put the pressure on him to really get the ball rolling with the New Deal. And he basically said, okay, I'll cut you a deal. I'll enact all these legislation to get these capitalists off your back, so to speak, as long as you cut the crap with all the socialist and communist talk, and that's how that ended up. So in other words, like, he recognized the inherent contradictions of capitalism. The socialists recognized the inherent contradictions of capitalism, and right now, the people who are suffering under it, who are making minimum wage and who need this government assistance, understand finally the contradictions of capitalism.
I would piggyback on this. You talk about the role of the government, the first thing that I think about is Marx's understanding of the state. Marx saw the state as being a crucial piece of the entire theory, right? States haven't always been around as a modern state, right? States are an historical creation, right? So if they emerge in history, isn't it conceivable, at least in theory, if not in practice, that they may not have to be around forever? Right, and Marx's vision, right, was the withering away of the state. Right, he saw the state as only existing because of the existence of private property. Right, and only existing to maintain a system of inequality that ultimately serves the interest of a sector of society, not the entire society. Right, the owners of the means of production. Right. And so I would go back when you talk about the role of the government. I would say that as a Marxist, or if you want to call me that, I don't know, as a neo-Marxist, a quasi-Marxist, as a fake Marxist, whatever, right? If you want to, that the eradication of the state as it's conceptualized today is really Marx's goal. Now you can say, well, that sounds anarchistic, right? Well, that's what I was saying before. It sounds like sometimes Marx talks about the state in his future communist society as being a state that is not political, right? A non-political state, he calls it, right? And so what does this mean? It's just like an administrative body, right? And so, maybe like healthcare, right? Maybe a nationalized healthcare that's an administrative body, right? Or the streets departments, right? As people plow the streets or whatever, right? As opposed to a political entity, right? And so if you talk about whether it's the evisceration of the state completely or whether it's reconceptualizing the nature of the state, I think that's what Marx is going. So if you talk about Marx's role of the government, if you talk about it in any other context than a Marxist sense, I think that's kind of missing the point. That's like a more of a liberal kind of idea rather than a Marxist idea.
And it's perfectly fine, but I feel like it's a two-front war here because we have to argue against all the great things the state did, but also argue against the state withering away. And I mean, on a strict policy level, I'd be more than happy, and like a good capitalist, to put a wager on where unemployment's going to fall quicker, France or the U.S. I'm more than happy to see how that goes. And you have, especially youth unemployment. You have Spain looking at a lost generation where youth unemployment is 45%. I don't think France is quite that bad, but
how about infant mortality?
What's that?
How about infant mortality?
I'm happy to create an aggregate factor taking both those into account.
Actually, skews.
Let's look at infant mortality. The rates of infant mortality.
Well, we'll have to wait it, but I'm happy to take multiple values.
Just since we're talking about that, there's very skewed statistics because the U.S. will actually let high-risk pregnancies be born because we have better it's called neonatal care. Is that the proper term? We have far better neonatal care here than any country in Europe, and so we actually let them be born, and they have much higher child mortality rates. We covered this in the healthcare debate, actually. We saw it in Victoria back there. We have sparring partners, but yeah, back to Dr. Stengel.
Well, I mean, I always teach my classes that putting ideologies on a continuum doesn't always capture everything. It's sometimes more, and maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe our two seats circle around. Because if we want to talk about anarchism, I'm not going to run from the room screaming. It's just I have a slightly different take on it. So one more policy. I think any good capitalist would tell you there's so many empty houses in the U.S. because we encouraged overproduction, because our tax code gives a false incentive about the value of home ownership, and that if we had a better, more responsive capitalistic system without the state sending false signals about the virtues of home ownership via a tax credit, we could have avoided some of those empty houses, just strictly on policy level. As far as anarchism goes, and am I allowed to name drop? I guess we're all being named some theorists. I mean, yeah, one of my favorite political scientists is not even a theorist. His name is James C. Scott, and he has a book, 2 Cheers for Capitalism, and one of the strongest sections in that book is on, you know, the petite bourgeoisie and the fact that they are probably the largest you know, class, but it's focused on small property ownership, and it's not about abolishing property, it's about bringing the notion of property back into maybe more of a sensible position. And I don't think you just have to read theory to understand that. I mean, the Arab Spring started when a frustrated fruit stand vendor wasn't, you know, he had to deal with government bureaucracy, and he'd had enough. But I mean, as much as the con law part of me would love that everybody rises up for First Amendment rights and more intellectual academic rights, is that like a cane? But I think you meet people where they are, and I think people, at least at the beginning, have their actualization in terms of what it means to be a person, more through aspirations to open up your own business, or you know, just even have a victory garden out back or something. And the political rights that I think we all value come later. But without calling it human nature, I think our aspirations initially begin at small property ownership. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Could I say something? Yeah, I think a lot of times also when, you know, somebody that's just left-leaning supports, you know, more welfare programs, idealizes the socialist democracies in Europe, they completely forget that that wealth was generated in the first place from market capitalism. Imagine if we were in the Stone Age and somebody said, I want universal, you know, food stamps. That would be ridiculous, because, you know, we're trying to get food every day. All of us would be scrounging for food every day. You can't have, you know, a minimum wage of $10 an hour if you're in the Stone Age. You need to actually get a wealthy society first in order to implement any kind of significant wealth redistribution.
We can go on that.
I mean, I'll get one rebuttal since.
Well, I mean, the whole,
Yeah.
did you want to move on? Or?
It just seems like you're.
I mean, just the fact that there are more houses, or there are, yeah, enough houses to, you know, house every homeless person means we do have the productive capability to house all these people, but we're not doing it because of private property ownership, not because of over-bureaucratization. I just wanted to point that out.
Move to questions.
One of the greatest success stories in human history is that of Bill Gates. The government had little to do with his dream, little to do with his imagination, little to do with his private initiative or his work ethic, and yet he built one of the most successful businesses in human history. His computer idea has benefited billions, not millions, of human beings. He provides a handsome wage to hundreds of thousands of workers. He provides them with a very handsome health package, very handsome pension plan. In addition, he and his wife are two of the greatest philanthropists of our time, providing millions upon millions of dollars to combat malaria, AIDS, poverty, starvation. None of that would be possible in any form of Marxism. That type of success and all of its blessings were only possible in a capitalist system.
I guess your question is, do I buy that?
I'm sure you don't.
Yeah, I don't. We talked about the importance of the state. This is a state capitalism, right? You know, the internet, the question is, would the internet have even gone off the ground if it wasn't for the state, particularly the military, right? The military research on the military actually developed the first internet, right? The military is a governmental organization, right? We wouldn't have airlines if it wasn't for the U.S. government. You know anything about the airline history, right? The government is essentially fundamentally important to the development of all this stuff. You know, we talk about, I'm not going to be defending a liberal capitalism or a liberal kind of marketplace, but, you know, you talk about the development of the high-tech sector. If it wasn't for public universities, Bill Gates went to Harvard for a year. He's from the middle classes, by the way. He wasn't a poor guy. He was from the middle classes, right? If it wasn't for the public universities in this country, not Harvards of the world, but the publics, the Berkeleys of the world, right? There wouldn't be an internet revolution. Right? This is pretty clear, right? And so these are all stated. If you eliminated Berkeley or reduced Berkeley to 20 levels, you wouldn't have anything, right? These are all state factors. You know, it's the idea that Bill Gates did it on his own initiative, without the state, without anything else, is a fiction, right? Not only with this technology, for so many other revolutions. And then you talk about the great generosity of Bill Gates. You know, I would argue that it's stolen money, right? It's so we pat him on the back by being so generous for stealing all this money and then giving it away, right?
Who did he steal it from?
Why is it?
Who did he steal it from?
This is what I'm saying. The capitalist system. The
Should he
capitalist
be
system.
prosecuted
Should Bill
for
Gates
some
be
kind of
prosecuted?
fraud?
Can we keep it?
I remember when Bill Gates arrested me personally to make me buy his laptop the other week. But thank you for the question, Dad.
And his art is really that bad.
Well, I was just gonna interject that the handsome man's question wasn't, it wasn't, about like any state intervention. Obviously, there's a government right now. When Bill Gates did that, it was that in a Marxist society, in this vague Marxist society, could that have ever worked? And I think if you go by, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, is that right? Something like that? That never would have happened. There's no way you have that kind of innovation if you're living in that kind of a society. The drive to succeed and the drive for that evil profit has benefited so many people in this world. That's why we've seen poverty decline so rapidly in the last 20 years. That's why we live better than kings did 200 years ago. I mean, people talk a lot about income disparity, and that's a problem. I believe largely caused by the state, but income inequality is what it is. Consumption inequality hasn't changed much in the US. Why? Because, a lot of middle class people, even a lot of working class people, even a lot of poor people have a lot of the same stuff that the wealthy in this country do. Obviously, you're not going to have a private jet like Bill Gates, but wealthier people live very similarly to the rest of the world. That was not the case throughout the course of human history. You had a king, you had nobles, you had a priest class, and then you had everybody else just trying to survive every day. We're not like that anymore. And that's not because of some overlords, some wise US presidents, or some wise French prime ministers. It's because people, through voluntary interaction, increased the standard of living very rapidly in the last 200, 300 years.
I could concede some things about the negative critique about Bill Gates and still argue that it speaks to the virtues of capitalism. And most of you in the audience might not recall this, but once upon a time, Microsoft was the biggest, baddest company on the block, and they were such a threat that we thought the government needed to get involved and break them up. This was the late 90s, a long time ago. It just stung for all you consumers because Internet Explorer came prepackaged, and so you might not think to install Netscape yourself. And I know that sounds a little weird because you probably got the earbuds from your Zune or whatever Microsoft's attempt at that was, but the market took care of it. You use, Firefox is outdated now. You use Chrome or Mozilla, and you listen to iPods, and nothing did a better job of breaking Microsoft's stranglehold over consumers than capitalism. And around that same time, and I got to admit, I'm a beneficiary of state education. I did my PhD at Madison. It's not quite Berkeley, but it's hopefully not too, I think I can take some pride in that. And once upon a time, I would frequent the quasi-anarchist bookstore, and I remember buying this little postcard for sale. It had the U.S. flag, and then all the stars were icons of different corporate behemoths that were, turning the U.S. into this, capitalist dystopia. And I would read John Nichols in the Madison paper talking about how they've got 5 or 6 media companies affecting the quality of the news you get. And 4 or 5 years ago, I think I read John Nichols calling for a government bailout of those very same companies because the market had so disrupted how news is presented that they went to struggling, if not defunct. And the market did that. The one benefit of capitalism, well, there's more than one, but one significant benefit of capitalism is it does a better job of dethroning kings or titans of industry than any other system I can think of.
And just very quick, we talk about the market like it's some sort of like computer or some strange entity, some abstract thing. It's people. It's all of us. You know, it's not always the worker against business. It's a lot of times it's, you know, all of us against the state. Again, they have a role, but I mean, the market is just us. It's what we choose to buy. It's where we choose to work. It's what we choose to produce. Entrepreneurs, small business owners, they're just normal people like us with a bit of ambition. They're not evil rulers that exploit labor. They're just normal people.
Rebuttal from either one?
Well, yeah, I would say a few things. One is, you know, this idea that America or capitalism is great because it produces wealth like no other system in the history of the world, right? There's no question that it has. It's incredibly prosperous, right? There's no question about capitalism being incredibly productive. State capitalism, right? Not pure capitalism, right? You can't understand capitalism today if you don't understand the essential and integral fact of the state's involvement in the economy, right? And so that's the first thing. And so if you try to fancifully separate the two, then you're starting to what's really happening, right? So it's no question that it is incredibly productive. Does that mean that an alternative system cannot be productive and more moral, right? Clearly, totalitarian systems that proclaim to be Marxist have not been productive and have been impressive. There's no question about that, right? Does that mean that we cannot envision the possibility of having an alternative, not a big state, right? Not a big state totalitarian system, right? But an alternative system, right? That focuses on the value of people, that's distinct from the value of things, that put people over profits, right? So that's one of the comments I would make. There's no question about the creativity, the productivity of capitalism. I mean, I don't think who's going to deny that, right? At the same time, capitalism structurally is riddled with lots of different problems. It's an incredibly creative, productive force. It's also incredibly destructive, right? You know, capitalism left on its own will destroy the planet in a not too distant future, whether it's through nuclear weapons or the destruction of the butterflies, my favorite little animals, right? It's like you know, capitalism. You know, it's an incredibly productive system. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So if you want to use wealth as the single moral criteria to assess the virtues of a system, then of course, right? But if you want to use human beings as a criteria to assess the virtues of a system, then you got to think otherwise. You talked about the incredible productivity, the decline of poverty. That comes out of the Davos thing, the Bill Gates thing in the Davos, right? You know, he forgot to mention that the vast majority of that wealth was in one country called China, right? Right? China, right, is the factor that the reason that the poverty rate in the world has declined in the last 30 years. In the United States, the economic situation of the United States has gotten worse, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. The facts are the facts, right? As we have liberalized the economy, as we have embraced this more market-oriented solution to problems, right? The poverty rate in America has gone up. The absolute and relative poverty rates have gone up in the United States. The middle has shrunk, and the top 1% and the top 20% have prospered tremendously, right? And the average wage, the average income of Americans has stagnated at best, right? It depends on, you can play with the numbers and talk about the, if you include the incomes and wealth of the Bill Gateses of the world, and you factor that into to look at averages in America, then you can say that, oh, Americans' wealth is about the same or maybe increased a little bit. But when you look at it in terms of other more realistic measures of central tendency, you're going to find that the average American wealth has declined in the last 30 or 40 years, right? And so this is more of like a liberal kind of argument rather than going back to the communist argument, Marxist argument, right? But I'll stop.
No, I was just going to reiterate that since the 1970s, real wages, meaning the actual value of the dollar in terms of inflationary money, stagnated since the 1970s, and that has contributed, like you said, to, the wages of CEOs has constantly increased almost 3, 4, 5-fold at this time. And yeah.
I just wanted to get to another audience question.
It's such a good book.
Oh,
I'm gonna finish my
yeah.
statement.
God, it's so, I didn't do anybody from this side, I don't think, so, yeah.
Okay, so I'm sure Victoria and I are glad to see our two debate opponents last time not going at each other.
Against each other.
But my question is about democracy and how it relates to both of these. And, you know, the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Just very simply, how does it relate to each?
I'll start with, since, you know, we are a capitalist democracy.
Well, that doesn't seem
Oh,
to
that's
be
not-
something that everybody would answer. The role of democracy, it's a mixed bag, honestly. You know, and a lot of this will turn on what you want to do with which variety of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I don't think abolishing democracy is anything I would call for. But I don't feel like I need to defend existing democracy if and I don't anticipate arguments, but if capitalism has corrupted our democracy and I'm somehow expected to defend democracy, you know, I'm not going to walk into that either. I hear this notion, and I don't want to sound like I'm asking about faith, but that we need a different mode